Okay, great. Um, so once again, I'm Kate Barron. I'm part of the iAssist Professional Development Group, and this is a professional development webinar slash discussion. Today's webinar will be introducing the Data Collection Development Interest Group. And with us today, we have Barbara Este and Ron Nikau, who will be leading or coordinating that group. And I'll just introduce the two of them. Um, so Barbara Este has been the data librarian at Yale University Library since 2018. She assists faculty and students from across the university to find, use, and manage data throughout the research data lifecycle. With 25 years of experience working in academic libraries, she brings a broad perspective on data support with an interest in making data available to researchers at all levels. And Rod Nikau serves as the librarian for economics, political science, and social science data at Stanford University. He has been the representative to the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research, or ICPSR, and the Roper Center for Public Opinion Research for over 20 years. In 2019, he received the William H. Flanagan Award for Distinguished Service as an ICPSR official representative. So I can hand it over to Ron and Barbara now. And I think as they can speak more too, we're hoping that this will be a forum for some discussion and questions. So yeah, I'll give Barbara and Ron the floor.
Great. Thanks, Kate. And welcome, everybody. First of all, Barbara and I would really like to thank the iAssist Professional Development Committee, in particular Kate, Wei, and Sarah, for inviting us to this, but also for all the support they've given and nudging that they've given us to help us kickstart this new interest group on data collection development. Barbara and I were very overwhelmed by how much interest there were. And just as a caveat, our initial idea when we were going to do this was to have more of just an informal discussion to kind of continue to get the ball rolling. But it's hard to do that when there's so many people. So we had to try to figure out how best to do that. So one thing that we do encourage people to do is please post any comments, questions, or any kind of data points or experiences or anything that can help inform the group as it continues to evolve. And we're going to save the chat comments so that we can refer to them. It'll be an initial data set for the interest group to use as it continues to build itself. And so with that, we wanted to start with a little poll to kind of get a sense of who you are, what is your data collection development experience, and what areas would be helpful to you. So Sarah, take it away. Great. Wow. So as people can see this, right? The results, I assume. A huge percentage, 87% of the attendees who answered the first question are librarians. another 7% curator archivist, 0 researchers, and then 6% other. So I think this is kind of represents a lot of IASIS, although it doesn't represent the actual distribution of IASIS members. But I think in particular, all of the librarians who have some sort of collection development responsibility in their job role, this is part of the reason why we started this, was because it is really something that is becoming more and more part of what we're struggling to figure out in terms of we know how to buy and purchase books and get them processed and get them out to users, but when it comes to data, it becomes more interesting. So let's go with the second question. Wow. Okay. This is actually very insightful. Um, this is Barbara and I came up with different categories that we felt and kind of captured a lot of the data collection development kind of workflows and issues people might be experiencing. But of course, we know we're missing a lot of others. And again, that's kind of where having more people from different kinds of institutions and different kinds of job descriptions will really enhance and enrich what we try to address in this interest group. But it's not surprising that the development, getting researcher requests is really up there, which would and then supporting data use to me is expected. Working with other units and staff on data collection development, very high, and then lower percentages on the other parts. But I think this is very useful. I don't know, do you have anything to say, Barbara, on this?
No, I think this really shows that we're all in the thick of it throughout the entire process of data collection development and supporting the researcher at every stage. So this is great.
And so let's go with the final question. And just so you don't have to read everything over, it's the same list, but it's more like, what of these areas would be more helpful for you to do your work? Yeah, kind of makes sense. The things that people had the most experience in terms of the previous question, less maybe need to kind of get more help from the interest group. And the areas like, for example, formulating data access rules or data use agreements, a little more wanting help or whatever, or discussion on that. Yeah, thank you. This is going to be very useful for us as we proceed. So I think we will move on to the next part, and Barbara, take it away.
Okay, so I think this poll really shows why another interest group. And so I think a lot of us have had having a lot of conversations with people we know when questions come up. I think it's clear that researchers are looking for things that, I used to call weird, but now I'm trying to move to a more non-standard sort of language. And so these things are complicated. And it's very intimidating to make cold calls. And, we spend a lot of time Googling, we look at people's LibGuides, we try and look at catalogs, we look in WorldCat, and some of this stuff is successful, some of it's not, at finding who is your resource. And so depending upon how big your network is and what kind of resources you have and what kinds of outreach you can do, it can be kind of difficult. So the more conversations that, small conversations that have happened, especially at this past IASSIST, people were looking around going, well, why don't we have an interest group? And we should form an interest group. And sort of Ron and I looked at one another and said, well, if you do it, I'll do it. And so here we are. And so what we want to do is we want to really look at these questions, build a community, and really kind of create an environment in which it is comfortable to ask questions. I know the first time I sent something to the IASSIST listserv, I was convinced people were going to think, okay, this woman just has no idea what she's doing. And so it can be very intimidating. And so we want to take that out and look at a smaller group that this is their interest, and we want to foster that community. Ron, do you have anything to add?
No, I mean, I think it's basically over the last few years, there's just been a lot of side stuff going on and a lot of one-on-one things. And I think at the last IASSIST conference in Philadelphia, getting together physically, face to face, and talking with different people and having small discussions, I think it demonstrated that there's efficiencies and there's ability to reach out to a broader group of folks within our IASSIST community to really help support each other more on these issues that people are struggling with, often in isolation.
Exactly. So these are just some challenges that we were thinking about. I mean, these are things that I come across every day, but what is happening in the chat right now and the results from the polls that we just did, there are so many more other things, whether it's access, whether it's cataloging, whether it is deaccessioning, whether, my personal favorite is when I'm asked, do you have a list of every data set that you have? And I'm like, ooh, like, how do you do outreach? And so what we want to do is we want to surface these challenges. We want to really, get people comfortable about talking about it. And, it doesn't have to be one thing. We don't want this to be, we're only talking about certain acquisitions or we're only talking about certain things, because as Ron pointed out earlier, that books are kind of easy, or libraries know how to deal with books. You either can buy the book or you don't. It's digital or it's physical. Maybe you have to decide which library it goes in. But when you're dealing with data collections, you have storage components, computing components, things that your e-resources department does or doesn't do, conversations with your IT departments, dealing with, odd access requirements. So we can learn from one another. Every conversation I have with somebody, I take something away, think about something very differently, get really good tips. So we want to foster that.
And I think, as we have listed on it, I mean, some of the areas that have come up, are struggling with issues of computing, because as opposed to when you acquire a book or another object, there's usually an existing workflow. You don't have to, when you have a book, you don't have to necessarily, if it's in another language besides English, you don't have to train a person to to be able to interpret that book. You can get it, you put it in, it gets cataloged, it has it a shelf. There's a whole process of circulation, storage, conservation, all the issues that the library over the years has developed really well. But for example, because of data, the first thing that has to be dealt with is people need to be able to use some sort of program, do some kind of have some sort of computing power to actually access that data. So is that something that we have to often take more responsibility to grapple with? Again, storage. Now we are acquiring things that are over like 5 terabytes. And it's not like just come and bring your zip drive and then copy the 5 terabytes to it. And even if they could do that with an external drive, the ability to actually do compute on it becomes more difficult. I don't know. Do you want to continue, Barbara, with the list there?
Oh, I mean, we talk about these things, like the terms and restrictions. Every license has a different level of terms and restrictions. Every institution has a different level of risk that they're comfortable with. We try and negotiate, things, items for reproducibility or for co-authors that, here at Yale, I know a lot of researchers work with researchers outside of Yale, and we're trying to figure out, can we cover some of these people? And so thinking about the wide variety of restrictions is important. I am sure all of you can have experienced the time to license problems of it can take anywhere from 6 months to a year sometimes to get a license complete, the data received, cataloged, or made accessible. And that it's not good for research. It almost shocks me when it does go by quickly. I figure like the shoe's going to drop and something bad's going to happen. But we need to think about what are those workflows and providing support. Where does our job end? So if we acquire this, we store it, we make it accessible. Do I have to know about every variable that's in the data set? Do I have to be able to do the math when somebody says this data doesn't look like this data, and why is it that this is calculated in a different way, or why is this missing? Like where does that support model come in, and how are other institutions handling it? So I think the more we can talk about it, the more it becomes less scary. And because we are dealing with a lot of these things on our own.
And in particular, the time to license, because that was one of the things, at least from our non-scientific sample from the poll, is not as many people have experience with the licensing process. I mean, does your institution or organization have a specific licensing librarian or licensing person that handles all the negotiation when you're actually purchasing a data set? But even if there is one, there are often items that need to be paid attention to that, say, a person who has more of a legal or licensing kind of orientation cannot anticipate or represent all of the kinds of things that our users may need. I mean, one example for us has been what if a student uses the data that's licensed only for our institution, submits it for publication, graduates, gets another job, and then gets a response from the publishers to do some further analysis. So we actually, based on that and representing that need that was not in the original licenses, we renegotiated to start including, clauses that would allow a process for folks who did research when they were actually authorized users of our data to be able to get access to it for review, for publisher or editorial review. So I mean, that's just one particular example that will often come up, and that's why it's so important for all of us who are really at the front lines dealing with the people who use the data to make sure that the license agreements can, as much as possible, include and anticipate the needs that they will have. The other part of that is translating a license, which is not always that easy to read, into something like a data use agreement that you want the user to read and understand the limits and restrictions. So that's another role that has grown more and more over time. And so it'd be interesting to see how much other folks at other institutions have been dealing with that. Anything else, Barbara?
Nope, I think we can move to the next thing.
Okay. So the initial objectives of the data CDIG, or the data collection development interest group. And again, these will evolve over time, but we all felt that it was important to create an inclusive community of support within IASIS. I think that's that's a real secret sauce, not so secret sauce of the IASIS community, is the networking that goes on, but also just how great people are at terms of supporting each other as we all struggle to do our jobs the best we can. So we want to make sure that that's a core part that's built, and that dynamic is built into this interest group. We want to make sure that we include everyone across all spectrums of data collection development needs. So again, there's folks that are from universities that have long histories of purchasing data and have maybe more developed workflows in place and staff and divisions of labor. And there are others who are just beginning to dip their toe into it. So we want to make sure that this provides a space, the interest group provides a space that can represent all the needs and the ability to share all the kinds of questions and all the struggles that people are trying to cope with or come up with solutions with, and really, again, create that, that more collective sharing to come up with better insights and things on what we're doing. We want to have an environment that really promotes and makes people feel comfortable to really share any of the problems and their ideas and their solutions, and not feel like there is a one right solution or a legitimate idea or problem. And so again, it's part of building that inclusive community. And last but not least, which is why this is part of the professional development aspect of IASIS, we want to help us all do a better job wherever we are at. So I think, unless anything more on that one, Barbara?
Nope, I think that sums it up.
So things to keep in mind. We want to basically respect the differences between institutions and roles, and sort of not really get so pigeonholed into a certain way of looking at what is really where people are coming from, or who should be actually involved in data collection development. We want to respect restrictions. So we want to make sure that we have the interest group does not, in a sense, let people or expect people to basically share things that they shouldn't be sharing. Because often when you're negotiating with vendors on your own or licenses, there are restrictions. So we want to make sure, at least as a collective, that those kinds of restrictions that people are under are respected. And then finally, so far, and there's going to be a lot more as this group evolves, we don't want this to just be a forum to complain about the vendors, which you can easily do because there's so much to complain about. But we want it to also be productive to see how can we take those often legitimate complaints into a broader assessment and perspective, so that we can actually be more effective and, possibly be able to do more effective lobbying to kind of change what's the horizon and what's going on in the future in terms of vendors, because often we are kind of isolated when it comes to our relationships with the vendors. So I think that's the things that we had for kind of more our thoughts on the character and nature and makeup and objectives of the interest group. So I think we'll end with at least my presentation part on what's next.
So we have a mailing list and we want you to join us. And so the instructions for the mailing list are here on the slide. And so the mailing list can be an evolving thing. I think this is where we should pose questions. We should, comments, questions, ideas, it's open. send what is important to you, and, you know, let's keep that conversation going. We need to plan some programming. And so this is a lot of what we need from you and I think a lot of this has come in the chat already, a lot of it from the poll as to what you're interested in. What I think we can isolate, who seems to have something to say about some of these topics, and we can sort of do some, planning and some programming. And to do that, we are going to send out a survey. We're still kind of working on that survey because we wanted to get input from you in this kickoff meeting to just kind of take the temperature, see where everybody is as to where sort of interests are. And so if we're going to send out a survey and just to kind of look for frequency as to how often should we have programming? What kind of programming? Should it be, you know, like a coffee clatch kind of quarterly, what's on your mind sort of meeting? Or is it topical of, let's take you know, people are looking at public record data and how are you dealing with the restrictions? How are you dealing with access, and sort of have more of a roundtable discussion? All of this is possible. And we've also submitted a panel proposal for the next conference. That does seem a little, I don't want to say backwards, but I think part of it was we need to get this organized, and the deadline to submit a proposal was looming. So it was sort of all happening at the same time. But this also is another good way for us to engage. And our proposal includes issues around licensing and curation, you know, data storage and access, identifying key players at your institution to work with you, as well as vendors, and evaluating data quality. And so this was the panel proposal that was submitted. So we're hoping that that's accepted so that we can further talk about these issues in a broader forum. But until then, we have the mailing list and look for our survey.
Yeah, and I think we want to really, because this next IASIS meeting, in addition to the fact that it's going to be in beautiful Halifax, will be our opportunity to actually make a splash. So, you know, we anticipate organizing roundtables, you know, possibly other kinds of ways that we can really inject ourselves into the experience and the discussions and the connections that are built, you know, using the Halifax conference as sort of a one objective point to really try to get our acts together enough to really have an effective impact. So I think that is basically what we had. And so our last slide is questions, but I think, you know, we really appreciate all the comments people have already put in the chat. I mean, a lot of the comments people put in, especially the one I think from Bruce about deaccessioning CD-ROMs, which, you know, we have thousands and thousands of them here at Stanford that we're still trying to figure out what we're going to be doing with those. But continue to put ideas, suggestions in that. But I think we'd like to open up the questions. And if you feel comfortable, we would like to open you up so that you can actually, you know, be heard, if not seen, and maybe try to create some sort of semi-discussion going on from this point on. So.
And I'm still laughing about the CD-ROMs because right now I have 2 boxes of hard drives that are in various states of taking them apart so that I can try and get data off of them because they're old. And anybody has an idea?
Do you still have a floppy disk drive that works?
Oh my God, we've got all pieces and parts. Floppy disk drive, I got 2 CD drives, and then I've got some sort of widgets to read these hard drives. I feel like I'm running a Radio Shack in my office, and a lot of this is just trying to figure out, you know, how do you make this stuff usable? You know, one of the collections that we have is from the Linguistics Data Consortium. Yale is a member, and we get data from them on USBs, we get it on hard drives. And they've been treated very differently across time. And so it's like, well, what do you do now? Bob Ray, what's on your mind?
Vendors came up, and I think rather than, taking an adversarial point of view, which you stated is not our goal, is really viewing them as our partners. And particularly if there is a vendor that we're having challenges with, or we want updates, that could be part of a regular feature. There's a lot of groups that, for example, the American Library Association's Business Reference and Services section has a publishers forum where they invite vendors. They give specific questions, so it's not intended to be a sales call. But that might be a way to involve vendors. I saw at least one of our vendors we had a rep from today. There are probably others that I didn't recognize on the list, but hopefully that's something we could consider.
Sounds good. Loris.
Now that Bob Ray and Ron both have their cameras on, well, he turned his off. Frequently, we're latecomers to data sets that you guys have negotiated, and you were front runners, and the licenses that you may have developed years ago, well, the vendors have changed their attitudes. And so I'm always happy to throw you guys under the bus and say, look what they did for Stanford. Why aren't they doing it for us? And so it'd be great to have a formulary of best practices so that we could talk to vendors from day one. The front runners can say, look, if you want to make sales or you want to get this stuff out there, here are the things that we usually ask about. And they might include things like, people who've departed campus, for instance, as in the example that Ron gave, or things like that. But just this list of consensus best practices might be helpful.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I mean, it's hard. This is part of the group as it evolves to try to prioritize what are the things that can be most useful to most of us, and I think that, kind of a best practices could be helpful. Just to kind of because sometimes just as when you are working with a researcher, especially an undergrad who's not done research before, you often have to basically find out what they know and what they don't know, so you can help people ask the right questions, and so you have to engage in a dialogue. And I think that's another thing we want the dynamic of this group to be, is to really promote that dialogue among all of us who are all at the front lines of trying to grapple with these issues.
I think we can also, to build on what Bob Ray was saying, because we've had informal conversations about this as well, about not only vendors as partners, but trying to advocate for support. There have been data that has been purchased by many institutions that, academic use is not their biggest client. They don't really care. And sort of if we can band together a little bit more and, either find that right contact, get into with where the data people are instead of the salespeople and at the vendor, or really uncover some good, maybe it's a quarterly call to say, okay, these are researcher questions that come up. Maybe we can facilitate that, because I think that some of this is really difficult, especially when you're buying, I'll say, non-standard, non-academic products that are meant to be housed in these massive SQL server environments, managed by 25 people in a room. And instead it's me taking an FTP download going, maybe I can get this to open in Stata, then I kind of look around and say, well, how did you do it? And how did you do it? So maybe we can have more of that sort of the technical side of data use from the vendor as well as the sales side.
I'm scrolling through the chat, and I'm glad that people are putting these things, because this is why it's good to have more voices involved, because I'm seeing things that, oh yeah, that's a great idea. I didn't think of that or whatever. And so I wanted to just invite people. Is any, have we missed the boat totally on anybody's own particular needs or situation at their institution? Is there some burning issue when it comes to data collection development that you would really like to see this group try to somehow address for your own institutions or your own needs? Or I'll take that as Barbara and I addressed all of everybody's possible or future needs going forward. No, I
Okay,
think
can you hear me, Ron?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
I'll
Christina.
speak up, as someone who's, we are caught in the middle between academic and corporate. We have, like I said, I think, two of our biggest needs are, number one is finding a way to tie our data products to actual defined usages. Not necessarily in numbers, but in importance, right? So that we have a way of justifying tighter budgets, right? But also there's other things like there's interest in actually understanding the data variables and getting down to what's actually in these to better match them to people's usages. Because even we have this, we have this massive 13-headed Hydra, and data is used in vast ways. And it's really hard because it gets bought 2 or 3 times because this division buys it for their own use and won't allow anybody else to have it because they insist on having it behind 23 locked doors. And so the IT world is trying to take over data cataloging without taking into consideration all of the licensing and things that we keep in mind. And then I think the other one that is a big topic for us that is still part of acquisition is what happens when there's a breach at the vendor that could reach to your university and create security issues, right? So cyber attacks on data vendors that could, because if you have a tie to that vendor and you're getting a feed, right? Or they have your information. So that's been another, so those 3 topics I think are what are really driving us, is tying it to real usage, diving deeper beyond just calling it Bloomberg or Haver and understanding. And then the third is, how do we create contingency planning when we have to flip a switch off for a short period of time? So that's what's really, I think, driving in ours. And I know these don't 100% translate to academic institutions, but I do think we, for the most part, pull in the same direction as a lot of universities.
No, that's great. I mean, in particular, your second point, I mean, that's another thing that often we struggle with especially when we're trying to acquire data that really a company has not really looked at academic use. So often the documentation is horrible. I mean, so, what's the process to try to maybe there's a way to build more collective sharing of documentation, or, because I think, I know that we often will base often on questions from our users, because they're the ones who actually dive into the data and say, how come they did it this way, or what's that? And then we will ask them, and then they will try to come up with something. And so, we kind of try to collect kind of snippets of documentation or other kinds of questions or answers. And I don't know if, again, how much others have had to struggle with that, and how do you actually put that together, unless you don't sleep at all. I mean, it takes time to do all of these things. So it's just another thing. But I think the collective helps us anticipate questions and prioritize where we can put our limited time and resources toward. So I think that's another way of looking at how we should focus the activities of this interest group.
Well, there's definitely no shortage of issues to address. under any circumstances. I mean, and these are all excellent and they're all things. And now I've got another one that keeps me up at night with the whole breach at the vendor. It's like now I never even thought of that. So that's a whole new dimension of things. But no, this is great. I especially like the idea of creating some sort of shared, place to put notes, some sort of repository, some sort of FAQs, if we could figure out some sort of good documentation, because we are all learning things about data sets. And I know I try and get every doctoral student or research assistant who is working on something to document all their problems. And so if those things can be shared, I think that would be really useful for everyone.
Any other ideas? You can always, again, join the interest group mailing list and post questions or comments to it. Also keep typing away. There's been so many great comments and suggestions and questions and sharing experiences in the chat. And then you have Barbara and my direct email addresses. So feel free to just contact us if you have any kind of questions. I don't want to make this last longer than it needs, because I can only stand being on Zooms for so much time a day, and I don't want to use up my allotment for today. But if there are other comments or questions, or if people have something, please raise your hand or chime in.
Ron and Barbara, this is just an administrative question. So we have the ISIS listserv, and we have a number of specific listservs for the interest groups and other things. So obviously, if you have a reference question, that still goes to the big ISIS list. If you have questions about service, etc., not everyone is going to be a member of this. And some people, and of course, ISIS, our membership changes as people join and so forth. Should we pose questions about collection development to this group or the big ISIS group? I mean, I could see starting out always on the big ISIS group, but then if it kind of becomes a little bit too specific, nitty-gritty, taking it off and putting it on the other, and it's always a chance then to promote this group. But as I said, I worry that some of our membership would miss what's happening when the questions may still be of interest, but I also know that the attendance here is fantastic. This is a group I've wanted forever. That said, we know that many of our counterparts, particularly outside of North America, this is not what they do. So, as I said, I'm always conscious that, while yes, US and Canada kind of dominate the list, we do have counterparts otherwise in other places where this is of less interest. So what are your thoughts?
Anything, Barbara? I could.
I
Go
think
ahead.
we can try both. I mean, I think it can be, I want to say that if it makes sense, if it goes to the big list, it goes to the big list. It's also one of those things that if somebody sent it to the interest group and some person in the interest group says, you know what, I think this has broader appeal, that it's sort of, or we could, once something is, I don't want to call it solved, but if there's some sort of good outcome, so it's not a lot of back and forth, we can send some sort of digest of the answer to the big list that says, this has been an ongoing conversation over in the data CGIG. We're still trying that out, but I think we can get that, we can use that shorthand. And then we can just kind of add it to the big list, just so that we're not missing anybody, and sort of advertise this list there as well with those answers.
I really like that approach. The other is, we have different communication channels. So if something is worthwhile, we can always turn it into a blog. As I said, I'm always interested in any way that we can promote ISIS, but also that we can share what we're learning with others.
And at the very least, I think working with Ashley, the list is set up to archive. So at least that will be kind of a raw kind of collection of the kinds of questions that actually have happened just at the list. But I almost feel like what you're raising, Barbara, is an issue or problem that I hope will happen eventually. I mean, so for me right now, it's fine to err more on, let's make it part of what's happening on the general list. And then if it gets too technical or too not really something of interest to enough people, then it can slowly migrate more to the data CDIG list. But I don't think there's going to be any set in stone thing. I think it's going to be kind of malleable in terms of where things get raised or quote unquote answered or whatever. Well, it is on my clock, it's 49 minutes after the hour. Do we give people the beautiful gift of time and early, or if there's anything else, please raise it now, and share your thoughts. It's always great to hear or see someone in the audience actually share what they're doing, because it puts a voice and a face to something going on somewhere.
I'll so feel free folks to raise your hand or add something in the chat, but I'll just start to wrap up. Thanks everyone for attending today, and thanks to Ron and Barbara for presenting. I think at some point soon we'll distribute a link to the recording as well. And I think Barbara and Ron had we'll send out a survey. So you can expect some some collection development related activity in your inboxes soon. And thanks everyone for attending, and we hope you have a good day. I don't think I see anything. I'm getting a lot of thank yous in the chat, so that's good. But I don't see any questions. So I think we can conclude.